Greetings, BookTube. This is ML Clark coming to you with Better Worlds Theory YouTube edition. I am joined as always by my special guest, The Highway, and I am behind my time, so I've missed my magic window for recording when The Highway is half empty. Every Sunday there's ciclovia here, which is a wonderful opportunity for people to go out on their bikes, just go for a run, be out in nature with much less traffic. It is a very common event in major urban centers in Colombia. When I tell fellow Colombians here that we don't necessarily have this wonderful magical spectacle in many parts of North America, there's a look of pity, which is earned, I think, because being able to rest a little bit and to focus on other aspects of life is quite important, I think, for overall wellness. But we do have other strategies, and there are changes coming in many parts of the world. So hopefully there will be a lot more of these kinds of events, more pedestrian-friendly cities, and cities that are not geared toward car culture as much as they have been. Fingers crossed. But I have missed my window. So right now the highway is slowly repopulating with all kinds of really important vehicles. And I get to talk a little bit about how this is actually a good thing, even though it drives me up the wall in terms of being able to focus on recordings, because it speaks to something that I have been struggling with as a writer for a while now, and that I think others have been struggling with too. It is extremely hard to do the work that we do in industry without being reminded of everything else that is present in the world, the cacophony of human voices crying out in need. And it is painful, I think, for quite a few of us to try to manage the work that we do within our industries and feel like it makes a difference, that we're not just frittering away our time and energy on something that isn't actually contributing to improving quality of life, dignity of life, when there are so many things going wrong around us. So as much as I have been perturbed and sometimes frustrated and sometimes ashamed by all of the highway sounds, it is a really good living embodiment of the fact that we can never really do our work in isolation, and we shouldn't be striving for that. To live in a bubble, to work in a bubble is a tremendous privilege. It's also not a privilege that necessarily allows us to think coherently about the larger purpose of our work, how we are building or hoping to build platforms with our creative output that will broaden imaginations, empower, affirm, uplift others, and provide, hopefully, some level of clarity about possible next steps, where we go from here. We might not be able to solve everything. I think in the past, science fiction especially has been a little bit arrogant in thinking that it might be able to solve everything, that we can write that one good novella and with our personal, or not just novella, but a full novel sometimes, and with that personal success somehow transform how the entire world sees the climate question, or the question of rising nationalism, or what to do with war economies. So many issues that are going to require profound systemic reforms. They're not necessarily going to be guided by what we write itself, so much as by the way that we conduct ourselves as writers and what we're moving toward with our praxis in total. So, long way of saying that I am learning to justify the highway sounds in the background and living with them, because if there are so many worse things that one could have to live with in the background of one's writing practice. And a lot of people who had creative dreams and do have creative dreams in the world don't have the opportunity to pursue any of them because there are too many other pressing crises in their lives caused by issues that we need to think about holistically and respond to in better ways than we have. So that's my little spiel about world grief. Now let's go into the main point of today's piece, which is we are going to be looking at Clarkesworld. We're going to be looking at the September issue, And then next week we'll be hopefully getting back to Asimov's, because I have to finish reading that next one, and I'm looking forward to that very much. And then hopefully we can catch up with Clarkesworld from October, and in November we'll be more or less back on track, and then able to look at some more things, film and books as well. I have hopefully another book review for you soon. As always, when I go through these reviews, I don't focus on simple signal boosting. It's not going to be like, oh, this story is awesome, you should definitely read it in that way. I'm going to try always to talk about broader concepts that are brought out by the work, how it ties into conversations about science fiction today, overarching themes, connecting themes. And this is in part because I really enjoy the idea of thinking about reading as a practice that goes beyond the specific commercial product. So it's not just about trying to boost one author, boost one work as a product. It's more about thinking, how does this publication add to the conversation? What is it adding to the conversation? And everyone's going to have their own views, but hopefully my approach gives you a little bit of that sense of continuity when you then go back, hopefully, and read the issue yourself. I started this practice, by the way, years ago when I was first published in Clarkesworld, and I realized, I want to read everything else in the issue. What's being published with me? What is the conversation around me? And I've always quite enjoyed doing that, but I do notice that sometimes in our field there's more of a fixation on just that one work. So if you as an author have been published, a lot of times the authors don't necessarily read even the other work in the issue. We can sometimes get so caught up in self-promotion that we don't really take the time to sit with the bigger context, the bigger cadence of what we're publishing. So I try to encourage that other practice, and I love when other folks do so as well, when they don't just focus on their own uplift, but really think about the platform and how to extend it to others around them. It's an ongoing process. I'm definitely not perfect at it, but it's something that I enjoy moving toward. And I like reading. I love these stories. These stories sometimes just blow me away. And this particular issue is filled with some really potent pieces. So I might be a little bit more excited about some than others. Sometimes I quibble with a few stories here. That's always a personal preference. And it usually speaks more to my own bugbears. But do keep in mind that I am going to get a little bit excited about a couple of them this time. First, as always, not everyone is going to be able to see the screen, so they won't see the cover art, but I love talking about the cover art because it does always create a mood for the work, and it is important to think about the broader framework of science fictionality that we associate to help coax imaginations while reading the stories. This piece, let's see, I have it all pulled up here. This is by Daria, Anako. It's called Reminiscence. And you can get that sense of reminiscence because this one's an interesting piece, because I've talked in the past about how some of the covers have a very clear juxtaposition of a few different elements, the human, the animal, and the machine. Here we have a human in a spacesuit, and there's always a little bit of a retro sort of punk vibe that comes from some of these figures, usually female, usually young. And this one in a spacesuit is sitting looking at some fond memory, the scrap in her hand, juxtaposed with this giant planetoid. It's got a ring. It has a glowing sensibility, so it's something it's probably a planet, but it might be a brown star. It is a celestial body, and it's glowing with the feel of a star, even if it has some elements that might put it closer to a planetoid. But so you know that this is kind of a surrealist juxtaposition. It's not intended to be a realist scene. But what's really neat about this, in terms of these beautiful shades of blue and orange with the bright yellow-white for the center of this celestial body, is the brushwork. And so you'll often get the juxtaposition in a few different ways. There's a sense of the traditional in the actual artistic style used for some of the elements in this piece, and so you will get a little bit of nature, but it also really has this feel of looking maybe at an old bit of scroll work, beautiful ink art with a scene with classic elements that one might find from, for instance, a Japanese painting in a different century, but of course with the astronaut, with of course something close to the present. So obviously Reminiscence that has that echoing effect, and it works really well with the pieces in this issue because there's a lot about memory. Not every piece is going to be heavy-handedly fit into that theme, but there are resonance points, and I find that every issue has some really good connections between work. So I'll try to highlight those as we go through the stories. Okay, so just adjusting a tiny bit so that I can take a look at these. Our first piece, there are two different possible reading orders depending on how your screen is set up. If it's a narrow screen, you're going to get every piece individually listed. If you have a broad setup on your desktop, you're going to get the stories in columns of 4, so your reading order might differ because of that. I'm saying this because there's no specific partiality. It just depends on whether I have a narrow screen when I'm clicking through the table of contents or not. I also want to mention, this is something I love about Clarkesworld, is that there's no intrinsic priority to the authors given. The names are placed not based on, oh, this is going to be a famous author, so maybe there'll be more pull. There's a strong sense of an egalitarian feel to how the names are positioned. Okay, the first piece, Marissa Lingen, The Music Must Always Play. This is one of my favorite kinds of stories. I love writing these myself. They are screwed up first contact stories. They are stories in which we have tried to make contact and it didn't quite hold for whatever reason, or it didn't work out the way we hoped it would. So in this case, the aliens crash and then they die. So there's no opportunity to get to know them. They have left these relics, obviously. They've left their pieces behind, and so humanity does what it does best. It tries to use, part of it tries to use this opportunity to learn about alien life. We have a linguist who's trying to understand language from the ship, and another part of humanity that's in a state of panic and riot over this whole phenomenon. Why? Has it really changed anything? Debatable, especially because our protagonist is also very human. While working in this phenomenal, transformational body of research, her father is dying, and she can't even properly share her experiences with him because he's so far gone in his journey toward death that the conversations are more about his quality of life. So it has this really lovely, understated effect to the whole notion of the importance we place on first contact. What does it mean to suddenly discover there's another species? I've done this in a few different ways in some of my stories, and I'm, as a result, very much attuned to seeing examples of this in the wild. But we really have changed our conversation around first contact. When we had early stories in the genre with first contact, there was for a while this strong sense of anxiety, but militaristic anxiety. Are we prepared? We're going to be annihilated, or maybe they'll come and they'll promise benevolence, and yet at the same time there'll be a trick. There'll be some sort of secret reason that they're giving things to us, and there was a lot of anxiety built into those, and combat built into those early notions of first contact. And then, of course, with that comes a whole body of peace work and the idea of being the courageous person who seeks peace. And then there was this lovely period of transgressive work that was focusing on maybe, oh gosh, we're going to meet aliens and they're going to be annoying. And we had all kinds of fun plays on these themes. But I think more today we are starting to see the overall hype and excitement of the concept start to fade and be transformed by the fact that we as humans are not very good with awe. We think we are. We think we have the capacity to hold the wonder of life maybe more carefully in mind, and yet think about so much of what we've been moving through for the last while. Think about how pandemic did not bring us together the way so many disaster films and alien first contact films says is definitely going to happen, that we'll have that moment of grace and unity eventually when seeing a threat larger than any of our individual nation states. Lies, as we discovered, not just from pandemic, but from all the stupidity that has come out after it. So our genre is changing because it is in conversation with the world of dawning awareness of our own, I don't want to say mediocrity, but our struggle to overcome a lot of mediocrity. So I like this verse story in terms of the gentle shift in conversation that it represents. Your mileage might vary. The next one, this is Tiffany Schwe's Fish Fear Me, You Need Me. And this is another fairly uncanny piece when it comes to memory work, reflection on where one person begins and ends. It has this wonderful conceit in the core plot. I'm not going to spoil it for you. We have two characters, Mac and our protagonist. They're on an island in a flooded landscape. And so there's going to be some biblical discourse in this piece, and it's brought out in an interesting way. It's funny, I won't quibble, and I will quibble with one thing. There's one point where it says that Lot's wife doesn't have a name. Lot's wife doesn't have a name in that story, but she's been tied in and connected in other stories, so you can actually find a name for her elsewhere. It's just that she hasn't been named in that one piece. Tiny aside. And it doesn't really matter to the veracity or the strength of the story, because many people will believe that Lot's wife doesn't have a name at all, and as a result, it's a very common concept, and it makes sense for the conversation to happen in relation to this piece in particular. So they are in a flooded world, and that means, gosh, it's really hard to eat. So you have to try to hunt, you have to try to make use of what possible plant life remains. But there's a difference between the two characters. Our protagonist will eat the fish of the sea, and there are more fish in the sea than ever. But Mac really does not like to eat the fish in the sea, preferring birds if possible. And there's a reason for this. We discover that the fish maybe are not entirely fish. Something that related to the disaster that befell this world means that a lot of people been lost along the way, and something very strange has happened in the aquatic environment. So the core, though, this wonderful conceit, allows us to sit with the question of how we define ourselves. Mac is not just the person that's present in this story. Mac is also somebody shaped by a lot of experiences with other people. So our relations do create these very fuzzy boundaries around where our sense of self begins and ends. So nice little visceral piece there. Laura Williams McCaffrey comes next with Broken. This is a story told in reverse, and Clarkesworld has a few stories like this that will play with the temporal arrangement of fiction. The question that's always raised when it happens is, what purpose does it serve? You don't want it to just be a gimmick without reason. There is, I think, a very solid reason for this story to be told in reverse. It has to do with putting us as the reader into a similar state of topsy-turvy as the character Flyer 2473. Flyer 2473 is struggling, waiting for a repaired helmet so that she can return to the real world. But what we are going to learn in this very brief piece, told in a tight way, is that the Flyer's perception of reality might not be correct. And yet, when we are seeing this in reverse, it allows us for a moment to get a sense of the sort of flipped expectations or flipped understanding of the universe that the character has. So it really is a beautiful blending of form and function. Not always the case. Sometimes people just like to play around with concepts, but I went back and looked at one a little bit carefully, and I think it works for this piece. The next one, Eric Schwitzgebel, How to Remember Perfectly. This is a lovely little meditation that ties into a few concepts we see discussed in our world around elderly care and not just elderly care, but dignity of life for folks in an older stage of existence. There's been a lot in recent news about music therapy and its impact for a lot of degenerative patients. We know that video games have been an absolute delight. Altered realms are something that a lot of folks in these spaces can still fully enjoy and lean on, even if a lot of other pleasures in life have gone away, and even if people have lost so many others by that stage of life. So here we have two people living together in an old folks' home of sorts, and one of them has just lost her husband, and yet she seems to be in a state of serenity about the situation that comes from the fact that there's a kind of joystick technology that she has invested in, which allows her to augment her experience of emotions. And so she and our main character, who's also lost quite a few people and sits with a lot of difficult memories, explore this technology, bond, grow together, have a relationship, and the whole piece uses these concepts to reflect on the nature of memory and the memory work that one does at a stage of life where there are so many losses and so many stories that have been told, quote unquote, to completion before your own is done, and how to care for yourself as a human being in that very strange space in life where you're not really in limbo, you're still fully existing, but so much of the work and the momentum of living has moved into the realm of memory. So I think it's a lovely, very generous piece that raises some good questions. The next one is a work in translation. Huzzah! I absolutely adore those when we get to pull something from a different context into our own. This is by Cirilo Lemos. It was translated by Thamirys Gênova, and it's called The Children I Gave You, Oxalaia. In this piece, which is from the Brazilian Portuguese, it was first published in Dinosaurus, there is a background that I think is possibly useful to white Western, Anglo-Western readers, which is that there's a lot of science fiction and fantasy in this realm, this part of the world, that focuses on two species coexisting. Sometimes it's a bird species and a human species. Here it's a reptilian species and a human species, and it routinely ties into the different strata, class strata, ethnic strata that exist in Brazilian society today. There's a tremendous amount of division, especially between South and North, indigenous groups, in relation to lineages that have a stronger connection to the original Portugal colonizers, and also a body of refugees that are quite common to the South American context. So a lot of that history and the way that this canon moves through that history of refugeeism, of classism, of colonialism, and its haunting aftermath is usually with those kinds of paired species. And so you'll get a lot of these kinds of stories. If you want one for a good juxtaposition, Anna Martino has Feathers, Sea, Silk, Sky at Abyss and Apex from a few years back, and that's a bird verse story. But it's good to get a vocabulary for yourself to really flesh out what is normative to this subgenre or this kind of device that is used in literature. In this case, we have lizard people from Venus, but don't call them lizards. Absolutely not. They are chordolans. They are no more lizards than we are primates. Well, we have primates. But the idea of just calling us or saying, you're just a monkey or an ape. Not a monkey, don't have a tail. But it's that kind of pejorative. So Cordelans and humans live together on Earth. Brazil in particular, there's this really interesting tension, very specific to a Brazilian context, where Brazil tries to present itself as humanitarian, very, very opening and obliging. It's bringing in all these refugees from a war that's been going on in Venus and that has made it very difficult for the Cordelans to live a safe existence there. But Brazil also still has quite a few problems, as depicted here through the idea of control, which is the name for this state apparatus that controls so much, literally, in the society. And control, as much as it sometimes says that it's generous and benevolent in the course of the story, is going to turn on these refugees. But right now we have a very rich, nuanced portrait of that kind of refugee existence through a family. We have Oxalaia, the titular character, is tending to two young humans because orphans, Brazilian culture, there is such a confluence of poverty and ethnic division. So the idea is very much embedded here that children are children. There are tons of children in poverty, irrespective of one's background. So in this household, there are two people, one of whom is clinging to the fact that his lineage back on Venus was of kings, but he's not a king here, and here he can barely provide for his children, adopted children in some ways, and his wife, and there's family tension around that, while there are also major systemic problems that require redress. And all of these different stories, the personal, the violent, the domestic, the poverty-ridden, along with everything else that's going on in the solar system as a whole, will play out in a very painful way. There are no easy solutions. And we have in this piece another character who is on the side of the state, but is going to make a choice to reclaim more of his own humanity. This piece could be tied into so many world events right now. It is important to remember that it also belongs to its own context. So these kinds of stories are so, I want to say, necessary. They are such a wonderful way to remind oneself of the complexity of every conflict. And it's just done so beautifully here because there are so many layers of conflict within it. And at the end of the day, there's just suffering and the question of how we are going to try to reduce suffering as a species. So, strong recommendation for that one. The next piece, Berman Ghan's Those Who Remember the World, is also a very confidently told tale. It's in the realm of the weird sci-fi, definitely is having its moment. Definite notes of Jeff Vandermeer, a little bit of Dark City as well, because it is so contained within the concept of the city. There is a city that seems to have an AI force guiding it, and it has the vault. It has this body of controlled genetic information used to create new life forms within its system, and yet it is also of nature, interacting with spaces like the wild park where there are other elements, extra city elements. So it's set far, far, far in the future, in the 8,000, well over 8,000 years from so again about 6,000 years from now, 6,400 more or less. And we have a bit of a murder mystery. We have a character, Lucy is what she's called by the system, the city, which creates elements as it needs them. So there is this very striking sense of the self as a unit of something bigger, as something that is part of a bigger web. But is the web human-made? Is it natural? Is it artificial? Something superhuman, but not necessarily sentient beyond what we have created in the way of artificial intelligence. The whole construct is meant just to be lived in. There are not necessarily going to be clean answers to the mysteries that emerge. The character is going to learn a lot about themselves and the nature of their relationship with other functions or functional organisms created by the city, and the question of whether their function, which is one of containment, is really what the city needs, is what this particular manifestation of the city is going to have to wrestle with. There are a lot of animal forms created by the city, again, part of filling out its own sense of function. It has different modules: Parliament of Culture, Parliament of Knowledge, Parliament of Change. So you have this sense of sitting in the story is sitting with our notion of self in relation to systems. And it's so beautifully done in terms of creating just a very comfortable, confident, lived-in, weird environment that I am going to be looking up Ghan's book, which came out this year, The Years Shall Run Like Rabbits, because I just feel in the hands of a very strong, confident storyteller, somebody who wants you to exist in a space not necessarily for reasons of plot to get to a certain outcome, but just to let your deeper expectations of space and self and community fray a little bit at the edges. So a very evocative piece, I would say. The next is Renan Bernardo's A Theory of Missing Affections. And I have to say, I reviewed earlier this year for Strange Horizons one of Bernardo's books, his latest work, Different Kinds of Defiance, which is a short story collection. I have to say, this story is so different from all of the stories in that collection. There's a lot of, it's a wonderful voice, confident set of stories in different modality. It's looking at something different than the other work. So I am really excited to see this direction, to see if the author continues to do work in this vein, because it's a wonderful, chewy premise. So in this work, we have the Birnian civilization. They are ancient, they are alien, and they are dead. They are gone. And when they left some relics behind, as many of these civilizations do. Those relics have created a very distinct set of mythic and scientific traditions. Some people have created Birnism, a whole religious movement around the idea that these ancient aliens were benevolent protector gods. Meanwhile, others have said, well, let's take a look at the actual relics and see what they say. And our main character has definitely been studying what he calls this highly punitive exobiological society. His scholarly research is into their torture implements and trying to understand them. That puts him at odds with his sister Kata. Now, what's really neat about this story is that in this universe, there's a warp gate between two worlds. The world of his childhood, it's his family home, it's where Kata lives, and the world where he's been doing his studies, where he's been working on this intense research. Kata is a big into the Birnist tradition, so she's one of the Birnirshi, and the Birnirshi they can't even look at artifacts from Birnian culture because there's a dogma against that, because there's such reverence, and she won't tolerate any kind of negative commentary about them. But our protagonist has spent their life, their passion and history and science and research, and in the course of this story is coming to a really interesting revelation that changes the flavor a little bit of their views of the Birnian people. And it's about why this species was so fixated on torture, and that's a lovely little bit of nuance that is in the background of the protagonist deciding where they're going to live when the big door, the warp gate, is closed. Because when it is closed for economic reasons, it's never going to open again. So they have to choose whether they want to stay in this world of more practical, accurate representation of the Birnian society, or be back with the rest of their family, living in a culture that has a very softened mythic approach to this ancient species. Really lovely nuanced themes here, a lot of deft commentary, and just it marks a body of work for the author that, again, I look forward to seeing continue to develop in future stories. The last of our short stories, as I've mentioned, the last one's usually a nice small one. This isn't as small as some of them have been, but it is still, I think, perfectly sized for its conceit. R.H. Wesley's A World of Milk and Promises imagines, what if we didn't have a parasitic relationship, a predator relationship as life forms. Most of life is in struggle. It's competitive. It's violent and it's brutal, and there's a lot of waste. Could we have an ecosystem of more symbiotic relationships? What would that look like? Would it look horrifying to us? Would it require us to give up things that are essential to our notion of self? This beautiful thought experiment imagines a character about to give birth to a child on a world where she's crash landed and she's lost her first child. But has she lost her first child? It depends on how you see, whether you see symbiosis as something that is possible, whether you can see this as beauty, whether you can see this as a fulfillment of life or its destruction in another form. It's like the Ghan story that I mentioned. It is an evocative universe. It is meant just to be sat in. Unlike the Ghan, it's not as fully fleshed out. It has a few core images that you're really meant to sit with because it's a shorter work as well. But nonetheless, both of them just require you to inhabit a space. Just be present in that space while you're reading that story. So we've got a good range. And again, I did say that there's a lot of memory work that goes into this. For instance, in Bernardo's piece, there's the question of whether the memory work that's being done about this ancient species should be done in a mythic way, a fetishistic, a spiritual way, or a scientific way. Are there other ways to use the knowledge of this ancient species? And again, Berman Ghan's piece, Those Who Remember the World, part of the underlying murder mystery in the piece comes from this sort of haunted phrasing. There's a contaminant in the system that, well, it's a question of whether it is something bad for the system to have this body of memory or not. And we have all of these, they have to remember perfectly as well, obviously in the title, calls attention to this theme. But even those stories like Fish Fear Me, You Need Me by Shui, where you don't really get the backstory of the character, you're still left with the question of lingering memories in our bodies and in ourselves and how they shape us. And so again, lovely resonance points across the stories in this issue. Then we go on to the nonfiction, which is another gift of Clarkesworld. And so Gunnar de Winter has this fantastic piece. Sometimes the pieces focus on histories of science fiction writing. Other times they focus on science, and they give some really nifty concepts that you as a writer can chew over or keep in mind while writing your own work. So A Genetic Recipe for Future Baby Making, just like the title suggests, is an essay that introduces writers to the technical world of genetics as they relate to the future of baby formation through some processes that are in the world today and some that are in process and some that are still conceptualized, and things that people are moving toward: IVF, artificial wombs, gene splicing. This is a really good guide for writers in terms of the ethics of the practice, in terms of changing these outcomes, and the pragmatics. What are the actual pressure points for many of these kinds of created beings? And it can be really useful for writers in terms of sharpening your own vocabulary when writing about this, so you have a stronger sense of verisimilitude, or also just to come up with some ideas to think about what are the core dilemmas in this field and how can they be used to generate story plots. So this is wonderful research for future tales, and you can always go back to the archives. Clarkesworld's nonfiction will always be filled with so many chewy scientific tidbits that could help spark a story if you're feeling a little flat. Then we get to the interviews, and again, Arley Sorg's interviews I love because they engage people at all points in their careers, early, mid, late career, and the conversations are very much adapted to the specific state of the author and their work. So we have in the first one, Disaster, Queers, and Romance, a conversation with Aliette de Bodard, and the life here of de Bodard goes through so many different cultural contexts: US, France, Vietnamese culture. And Vietnamese culture especially shows up in a lot of the space opera novellas for which she's famous. These pieces, de Bodard's pieces, are usually set in the Jula universe, and so there's definitely conversation here about the delights of writing in a shared universe, because you can really play with ideas and flesh them out from one piece to the next. But also, one of her new books is outside that universe. It's a space of fantasy that still involves Vietnamese culture, sentient spaceships, another very strong element for this author, space stations, also space jellyfish, so that should be fun as well. So there's a lot. This one is definitely a piece that focuses on the benefits of playing within a certain sandbox and how they can help you flesh out ideas. In this case, food, history, family roles, queer experience, relationships to space, and not just space in the literal sense, but also your environment, which is something that comes up when you have an individual character in negotiation with a sentient manifestation of their home. Next up, we have Mashing Tropes, a conversation with A.C. Weiss, and A.C. Weiss Group in Montreal. So this is a French issue because we have de Bodard in France and Weiss here. And Weiss now lives in Philadelphia. Her latest book, Out of the Drowning Deep, is also science fantasy with some noir and murder mystery components thrown in. So Sorg and Weiss discuss the fun in playing with those tropes and some resonance points across her career in relation to short and long fiction. That brings us to Neil's editorial, which is full of relief. Well-deserved relief after dealing with a lot of the challenges that we've talked about for the last while, and some stories here of recent promotional travels. But I just want to read one paragraph because I think this will give a really good sense of the state of the genre. As Neil writes in this piece, however, it's important that we not rest on this moment. We've lost a year of growth and still have a long way to go with regards to being able to pay our staff a living wage. While publications like Asimov's and Analog have full-time paid staff, none of the genre magazines like us, born of the digital age, have managed to cross that line. For years, we've aimed to be the first and prove that it can be done. We even made progress. If we could beat Amazon's demon, I feel even more certain we can beat this one. It stung that we had to put a pin in these efforts while rebuilding, but it is now the first thing back on the table. Pay increases will be directly proportional to how subscription rates continue to improve, and I'm happy to say that we've already made the first of several minor adjustments. Thank you. We've talked about this before. We're not going to get into a full piece right now. But if you love the kind of work that is being done in genre, if you appreciate the fact that the conversations that emerge through stories like the pieces in this collection are truly speaking to critical elements of our culture in the larger sense, it's important to support the work, and it's important to support the curators of the work. Clarkesworld has been in a very long-standing struggle to push for more thought about how we fund short fiction, and it's good that it has survived a devastating challenge in the last year, but we need to be much more ambitious. These are the kinds of goals we need to be working for in order to create a stable economy for new voices, to extend the platform to make sure as many different voices do get to be heard, that we get to hear more work in translation, more work that's very much responding to the moment that we live in. And I think we can do it, but we just have to keep in mind that that is the goal, not just to enjoy passively what we read, but to make sure that the conversations on the page are never viewed in a bubble. Just like I can't deal with my writing life outside of the broader context of my community and all the rush of noises in the background and all the trauma and the news that we have to engage with every day, so too must any of our fictional output be considered in light of a broader context, an economic context, and a context of human beings who are just trying to get by, and also to lean into the dignity of creative practice along the way. So, thank you very much, as always, for your time. I hope you enjoy some of these stories, always in the notes so you can take a look at individual pieces. If you like this, of course, like, subscribe, because it helps with the algorithms that YouTube uses to decide which creators get to have access to different funding pathways. But otherwise, go forth, and if Clarkesworld isn't your thing, think about what publications are doing the work that you enjoy and see what you can do to support them. Or support all of them. Who knows? There might be some wonderful benefactor out there who's able to do that. Until next time, thank you for your time. Have yourself a wonderful week.